And it's my pleasure to bring on Darren Manners. He's the co-founder of Red Spy 365, and he told me he's going to introduce himself. So I'm going to let Darren take over, man. Go ahead, Darren.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Thanks very much. So now we take a turn to the dark side. Let me just see if I can share my presentation out. Firstly, and can you see my presentation?
Got it. We're seeing your presenter view, however.
Oh, okay. I'll tell you what. Let me just, rather than do that, let's switch that around. I'll switch that over to the standard view. How we're looking now.
Got it. Great Michael J. Fox slide. So you're good to go.
You'll spot a theme throughout this one. So normally, people pick the Matrix things. I thought I'd do something slightly different. So firstly, let me introduce myself. Who am I? Me and my team. My name's Darren Manners. I head up the offensive security operations here at InterVision. I'm also the founder of Red Spy 365. Red Spy 365 is a continuous penetration testing service. It was designed to move penetration testing from a photograph to a movie. That's really where it came about. My background is I've probably been like 33 years in offensive and defensive security. I've spent 10 years in the Royal Navy. I was a communications technician, what we call now a cryptographic technician. The interesting thing there is, it's kind of lucky, I guess, the security thing took off. But when I left, I got told, I was handed a piece of paper that said, hey, all I can tell employers is that I could type. So I was quite lucky that all of this took off. The Red Spy 365 story first came about as a traditional penetration tester, and I call those photograph tests. I would go in, I would do a test, I would leave, done. Well, I had one company, I went in, I'd done a test, I left, and then unfortunately about 2 weeks later, they were compromised. So being a paranoid kind of guy that I am, I was like, well, what did I miss? And I found out I didn't miss anything. What had happened was, it was about 2 weeks after I tested, there was a Struts 2 exploit that came out. And unfortunately, the bad guy found that Struts 2 exploit and compromised the organization. So at that point, I said to myself, we've got to be able to do better. There's got to be able to do better. And I was at Black Cat presenting in the Arsenal section, ISO, which is part of the email phishing side of things in Red Spy. And I noticed that Raphael, who wrote Cobalt Strike, many of you probably have heard of Cobalt Strike, or, it's used by the bad guys as well as the good guys. But the idea with Cobalt Strike Talk, I noticed that there was a kind of synergy coming along. He was doing Rise of the Automated Red Team. It was a DARPA-funded project. But I started to understand that we could move from the photograph to the movie. The technology was there. And I really started looking ahead of where the technology is going to be. And there's that old phrase of you go to where the puck's going to be. And really, the technology is starting to come to Red Spy, especially when we're starting to see some of the stuff later on we'll talk about. So I was kind of in Vegas, and I went back to the hotel room, and I created Red Spy 365 1.0. That's really where the whole team came about. I've got a lot of certifications. I'm a SANS Cyber Guardian. I'm a SANS GSE. I'm a CCIE security. The only thing I want you to take away from all of that stuff is that me and my team, we really enjoy what we do, and we're very passionate about what we are. So we know there's a problem, and we know we're going to look at the problem and the solution as we see it currently. So typically, defensive infrastructure just doesn't work without ongoing adjustment. We know that, we are the cornerstone of, any kind of regulatory compliance, whether it be COBIT or other frameworks out there, or PCI or NIST. They always ask for those penetration tests. The difference is, I always talk about pen test being a bottom-up approach. I don't necessarily care about what you say you are. We look at what you actually are, and we hope that you are what you say you are. We meet in the middle, and if we don't, there's the gap. But things change all the time. So the old mantra used to be, you would actually change or retest if your infrastructure changes, or if you change things, they'd ask you to retest. To be honest, nowadays, you don't have to do anything. The world around you is changing fast enough for you to now sort of be at the back of the herd and picked off by the bad guys or the bad actors. So we know, look at, there's kind of three models we're starting to see. Manual penetration tests, they're kind of single snapshot. This is what I talk about, the photograph. Continuous vulnerability scanning, well, that's one part, but vulnerabilities are just one part of the equation. Sometimes you need to go, I always talk about being the onion and not the egg. You want to have that layered defense and test that layered defense and test those systems in place to make sure that not only do they protect, but you can see the responses of what they're doing. And then you've got these threat modeling services, which kind of like simulations, but because they're not actual attacks, they kind of have a limited value. And so my background is, intelligence. So I understand the value of intelligence diminishes over time. And that's the important aspect of it. So moving from the photograph to the movie makes sense. And it makes sense if you can understand, how we can show the impact to the organization. And we'll talk about some of that in a second. But moving from the photograph to the movie was the biggest thing. That was kind of like the key part of it. And the technology was there 8 years ago. And the technology is certainly coming to us now more and more. We're starting to see the ability to add and absorb new offensive capabilities and defensive capabilities as well. And we also, one thing we definitely know is there is definitely a shortage of cybersecurity talent. They talk about 3.5 million, and there's definitely a problem of trying to find people that can fill these roles. We got a poll question come up, and it's really talking about, how often do you conduct a penetration test of your security? Is it yearly, quarterly, monthly, continuously? I always talk about the skin in the game of pen testers. When you do a one-off, there's very limited skin in the game. I don't understand institutional knowledge a great deal. It's more a case of we rely upon your institutional knowledge to understand the context of a lot of the risks that we see. So that's kind of part of, as you start to move from those one-offs into continuous, you can start to add those ones in. So some of the lessons learned over 10 years of development, testing, and integration. You need new content all the time. Content is king. And what do I mean by content? I mean new tactics, techniques, tools, procedures, the new how to exploit. That's the content that we want to be able to add in, as well as understanding the business context and be able to add that in as well. So content, whether it comes from the company itself to understand content, or whether it comes from what the bad actors are doing, the tactics, techniques, and procedures, the fingerprints, as it were, of the bad guys, we want to be able to add that into the system. Now, I'll talk about Red Spy, and I'll talk about it being an ecosystem and not a platform. The reason being that an ecosystem does have a force multiplier, but we also need to keep those bad guys out of those ecosystems. And as we start to expand that ecosystem, you'll see how we're doing that with our own crypto fabric, blockchain, and actual marketplace. Agility is important. And in fact, when I was listening to Brent yesterday when he was talking about low code, no code, when I first created Red Spy 1.0, one of the ideas that I really had was I had to create it so that it wasn't, you have to code loads of stuff. I remember back in the day, when I first left the military, I had the fantastic title of Internet Architect. So I was the Internet Architect, for those that don't realize. But though back in the day, it was, everybody wrote websites in Notepad. If you was to write, and your Dreamweaver came along, and I was using Dreamweaver, and everybody was like, you're a heretic. You got to use it in Notepad. Look at all this code. But we understood that, that the actual technology was coming in, the speeds were coming up, pages were loading faster, and it was more about the creativity and the content than it was about the technology and where it is right now. So if you think about why agility is important, orchestration important, the ability was to create that Dreamweaver for pen testing, the low code, no code. We always talk about, especially in my industry, the ninjas. Everybody's got to be a ninja. I don't think everybody has to be a ninja. I just think they have to have the right tool sets, or maybe give the ninja a machine gun. The idea is to try and level the playing field with the correct tool sets. And orchestration for me is a way of being able to do that. It's low code, no code. It imparts the DNA of maybe a security researcher and takes it and puts it into a process and a format that Red Spy can understand. And you'll understand that a little bit later on. I always talk about this one. UX will beat functionality, but don't change it often. You know, a shiny user interface is what everybody wants. And I get that. And, you know, it's quite kind of a running joke right now. We will be updating our user interface. But once we finish our functionality where I want it to be. But right now, it's a kind of a running joke that we put that in there. But the user interface especially is like one of the beauties of working with Red Spy is you're working with the development team that builds it. And so you're able to say, hey, wouldn't it be cool if it can do X, Y, and Z? And we're able to do that for you. So content, control, agility. So where are we currently? We've always talked about Red Spy as a combination of tools, bots, and analysts. And I always say that, you know, my tools do repetitive tasks exceptionally well, but repetitive tasks not very well. Whereas analysts do interpretive tasks, you know, great, but not so much repetitive tasks. So we rely upon the combination of the tools and the analysts to be able to do that. That's interesting, how often, you know, once a year. I think what we're starting to see on that poll results is that you're starting to see it change slightly. That, you know, you're starting to see insurance and, you know, regulations talking about being able to do it more. So it's interesting, again, you know, the puck, we're skating towards where the puck is, and we're starting to see the regulations tighten up. So that makes sense to me, what people do, but also start to see closely follow behind monthly. So I understand that as well. Interestingly, you know, back in the day, Rob Joyce, head of tailored access operations at the NSA, was talking to Usenix Group, and he was said that, you know, the bad guys are coming at you 24/7, 365. You got to think accordingly. And they're looking for those temporary cracks, mistakes, misconfigurations. I actually get more access to organizations through temporary mistakes, misconfigurations, through, you know, that shadow IT department open stuff up at the weekends. So as you move from the one-offs to continuous, you definitely start to understand the threat surface much more closely. So Red Spy, as I said, is that combination of best of breed tools, bots and analysts. And one of the things I noticed, you know, very early on was, as you go from being a photographer to a movie director, you're able to understand and add in certain things like threat intelligence. So we use Intel 471. We can take the CVEs and map those to what the bad guys are actually doing when we see the risks. We can also take in and understand, you know, credentials that are being sold on the dark web. And this is closed source threat intelligence. It's not the open source threat intelligence. We're also able to take third-party breach notifications. So why would I be in threat intelligence? Well, one, I want to understand the risks, what I see to the organization, and what the actual bad guys are doing with those risks. I want to understand where the market's going, as it were. But also, you know, if someone does do a credential drop, I want to get that username and password and see if I can reuse it elsewhere too. And the other part is as well, we talk about here about compliance. So we use standard information gathering from shared assessment. Now you think, why would compliance be of interest to me? Well, compliance tends to be the root cause of any technical failure we see. You know, the control or the control object on a particular system like patch management, if that fails, then that leads to the technical findings that we see. We're able to sort of filter out events and significant events, and we map compliance to those significant events. So we're able to understand that when an event occurs, that significant event occurs, it's already mapped to compliance questions. There's some really interesting stuff going on with AI and compliance that we're really feeding into as well, and we'll talk about that in a second. But compliance allows me to understand why that technical risk occurs. Why is that important? Because if you don't fix the control object, then you're in the hamster wheel of death. We're going to keep seeing these problems every month or every couple of weeks or every time a patch comes out. The other thing is institutional knowledge. So a lot of you do things like a business impact analysis, where we're understanding, you know, what the business process is. And so once you've got the business process, you can start to understand, okay, this is the business process that affects this asset. So you tie the business process to the actual product tech catalog, and the product tech catalog, you tie to business processes. That's typical business impact analysis. And usually in a business impact analysis, you also put, system owner, data owner. You might also put whether it contains sensitive information. So you're able to add in a lot of institutional knowledge. Why is that important? Well, again, as you go from that one-off to now a continuous, so from a photograph to the movie, now you're starting to understand context. So that risk that I see on a problem, say, you might see it on an asset, 1.1.1, and I tell my CEO, hey, we've got a problem on 1.1.1.1, he's going to switch off. If I turn around and say, well, I've got a risk on a business process that's, 30% of the gross margin of the organization, then that's a little bit more context that you can understand. So maybe that medium risk is now a high risk, or maybe, when we gain access to a system, we're going to spend more effort on looking at those processes that need to access. So that's why, institutional knowledge, threat intelligence, and compliance, as you start to move from the photograph to the movie, you can start to add in those kind of things as well. And of course, it wouldn't be fair if we didn't produce nice and friendly reports that people can print off on demand. So it's always fun when someone says, hey, when was your last pen test? And you say, well, it's continuous. Here it is. The idea is that we're always understanding the baseline, the institutional baseline, testing against the baseline, so that any deltas that we find, we're able to hand out. And of course, organizations themselves, each organization gets their own portal to log into, and they can, there's a lot of data in there that they can play with. You can manipulate, you can map compliance, you can map business processes, you can start to understand the risk a lot more. And again, because we're going beyond that initial surface vulnerability, in other words, we might do phishing, where we put payloads in and gain access to a desktop. It's important to understand that we're not just, hey, look, there's a load of risk over there, you've got to go fix them, but we're going to, show the impact of that risk. So that's important to understand. And of course, one of the things I mentioned was we're an ecosystem. So to me, when I first started setting this out, one of the things I wanted to do was to make sure that I can add new content into the system. And the way I can add content into the system is by using things like tool access portals or marketplace. These are systems whereby analysts can go in and they can create content. And through the orchestration that we use, we're able to make that content available to all the management portals under the analyst control. So it's important to understand how we build, especially as the system is right now, that we can work in one area and be a force multiplier for the whole agencies or agencies under our control. Plus, I can share content with other analysts and they can use it on their agencies. So it's important to understand that we're not just, going what I call plate spinning, going from client to client to client. You're able to work in different areas and actually create multiple content like a bad guy would. It's essentially what they do. So now we come on to the most exciting part, I think, where we start to look at, this is going to be one of those busiest years for us, that's for sure. We're going to start to look at Red Spice 365 future. And I wouldn't be, a good engineer if I didn't mention things like AI. I mean, we started playing with AI when it first started coming out, started understanding the impact that we can have. So I'm just going to explain a little bit what I believe the impact with us especially is going to be. What I felt was interesting was someone said yesterday, I think it was in Brent's poll, one of the worries they had was, were the bad guys using it? Yeah, it's definitely one of the worries. Because we're seeing the bad guys use it already. And, they're typically using it for things like avoiding spam filters. You can ask ChatGPT, create me a HTML email based upon W-2s, but don't mention the word W-2, financial, or anything, anything else that might be captured by a spam filter. And it will actually do a very good job of creating a HTML email. Also, gone are the days probably of the bad spelling kind of fish emails when people access that. So I've got this great thing called the Augmented Virtual Pen Tester. So I don't believe that pen testing is going to be replaced by, complete bots, but I do believe, like as any other tool, it can augment what we do. So those of that have, you know, we link into Azure, and we've been playing with the Azure informed response or cognitive search. And what this enables us to do is to add client-specific data. So you might, you know, basically you might create an index of, you know, training, marketing, maybe, you know, unstructured PDF data. You can index that. And then in your actual augmented penetration tester, when you ask questions against ChatGPT, you know, it's going to point off to Azure's cognitive search to the correct index. So you're asking questions against your own data. The interesting part about that is, and what we've seen with it is, you know, it does depend upon prompt engineering. In other words, setting up the pretext. You've got to make sure that, you know, the application itself sets the pretext for the whole story. You might tell it that, hey, you're a cybersecurity analyst and you're only to respond to cybersecurity questions. But it will answer questions about that. So go back to what I mentioned about compliance. This becomes super interesting because now you can turn around and say, well, what if I put a blob of all my compliance and policy documents inside here? So I uploaded them from the application in RedSpy, uploaded it, and then I could ask questions against my policy and procedures. And well, lo and behold, SIG, like the standard information gathering from shared assessments, a full SIG is 1,826 questions, literally questions. So you could take those questions and ask them against your own data. So if you're being sent questionnaires, think about how you could ask questions against your own policies and procedures against your own data. That becomes super interesting. And of course, excuse me for coughing up. I'm allergic to everything, apparently, according to the allergy experts. According to sort of like one of the things as well we've been looking at is when we integrate into things like Azure's ChatGPT, we've also started to understand that, hey, we can integrate our tooling into it. So now you can integrate, you can use things like LangChain. I mean, you've seen things like in OpenAI, you can actually integrate, you know, Zapier, which integrates 5,000 other products. So you could almost very quickly, scale up basically tools being embedded into ChatGPT. But you can actually turn around and integrate custom tools. So we use like LangChain. So you can actually ask it, like, build me a bot based upon APT, 19. And it would understand the tactics, techniques, and procedures. It would understand how to build those bots. It would understand how they get mapped and actually build it. Or we've actually got it to the point where we can sit there and say, hey, tell me all the CVEs in the pen, or tell me all the CVEs in my risk. Can you map them to the IP addresses? You find one that's an unusual IP address and start asking questions across it. So that sort of changes the game in somewhat. Now, this final part is where it becomes a little bit more interesting. Note the Whopper operation here. I'm still keeping with the 80s theme for sure. So you've got like the marketplace data. And I always remember where I say where you put your ninjas. Put your ninjas especially, make sure they have the correct tool sets. The idea here is that we have the client data. We have the marketplace of tactics, tools, techniques, procedures, maybe services and modules. And we're able to compare and understand new content that comes out and how effective it would be against the client-specific data. But unlike simulations, we could actually execute that bot scenario or that tool scenario and actually see the results and go beyond, the initial surface area to start, post-exploitation. So this is where it becomes like you go from just asking questions about your own data to now understanding a whole heap more of what you can do with your data. It really does change things a lot, because now the marketplace data, which is kind of like the combination DNA of all the security researchers that you have, now can be compared to the client-specific data. And much like something in like ancestry.com, you're going to get a flag against your system, which means that you've now got content that may be specifically, and this is where it augments the RedSpy 365 analyst. So remember, you could be completely hands-off. We do everything. You could be as much involved as you want into the system. And in fact, as you start to see going forward, you're going to start to see more of an integration into you. You're going to start to see more of a tool, and you're going to start to see, measurements for us changing from, sort of typical do users log in, but to more, hey, how are they logging in? How are they interacting with the tool? So it's definitely going to make things a little bit more interesting for everybody. So that brings us on to poll question number 2. And this is, what would you like to know more about? Continuous testing, AI and security testing, mapping compliance and BIA to testing, or other, just send us a chat. This is the next thing. So if that wasn't enough to do, we've got other things we're adding. So the marketplace challenge response in crypto fabric. So the marketplace, to me, as I've said earlier, is about adding content into the system. So typical crowdsourcing is, hey, 1,000 people go attack this one IP address and tell me how you would do it. Or sorry, tell me the results of it, not so much how you would do it. What we want to do is take those same 1,000 people and say, tell me how you would attack that one IP address and sell that know-how into our marketplace. So we want to extract via our orchestrator, we want to extract the DNA of an attacker, as it were. Now, what most of you know is that attackers have fingerprints. They have the same kind of tactics, tools, techniques that they use. This is how we fingerprint APT groups. This is how we sometimes know that maybe the Russians were attacking as opposed to the North Koreans. So they kind of have a DNA. They have their own tool sets. And sometimes, hackers have their own tool sets. Security researchers have their own tool sets. And the idea here is that we want to be able to extract that and have them be able to sell that content into our ecosystem. So that becomes available. So we secure the ecosystem. One of the ways we do that is we've got our own blockchain. We actually are able to take content created in the marketplace, package it up via our orchestrator, put it into our blockchain, and it's in a format that Red Spy can basically ingest. So we go from asking attackers, hey, tell me the results of, to now saying to them, how would you do this? So now Red Spy becomes a combination of DNA. It's not just that one tester that's testing you. Remember, people will say, well, we like to change testers. And I'm like, sure, we'll change testers. We can give you different teams within Red Spy. But really what you want to be is you want to be a combination of thousands of DNA into the system. So as the marketplace builds up and it's got the DNA maybe of, 1,000 people in there, their tactics, tools, techniques, their secret sauce. Now that becomes available and can be auto mapped to the content and client data set. And it's packaged up in a way that we can understand. The beauty of the marketplace, though, is if you don't see content or you don't see services or you don't see modules in there that you think to yourself, well, there's nothing there for me, you can actually create a challenge. And this is where it's going to be a little bit more interactive. So we're able to turn around and say, okay, create a challenge. If you want a PowerShell script to do X, or you want a tool to do X, or you want something Y, you can create a challenge and security researchers can pick up that challenge and respond to that challenge. There's nothing out there that does that right now. But this is all about the concept of an ecosystem, keeping that ecosystem secure and maintaining that, what's in the ecosystem is only available to the Red Spy client. So security researchers that may have been afraid to put their content out before because the bad guys might get it, they can now put that content into the marketplace, have it packaged up on a blockchain and in a format that only Red Spy can ingest. So that's one way of doing it. And we also have our own crypto fabric, so we can do transactional, the idea is if you purchase something, it's going to be a quick transaction. So we'll have our own crypto fabric to keep everything secure as well. That's the marketplace. So you've seen there, two things, one, the AI and the marketplace. The next thing we've got is the Red Spy Scout. So the Scout to me is the lethality of Red Spy. So a lot of times we're using things like Cobalt Strike, Metasploit framework, interpreter. The idea is that, we want to be able to take, the lethality, because really, a test is only as good as its lethality. That's really what it comes down to. We want to be able to find those temporary cracks, mistakes, misconfigurations. If we create malware, we want to bypass the EDR and get past those things. That's important for us. And I see a lot of people are talking about the AI and security on the poll result. That's the number one. They want to learn more about security. I think it's a really interesting side of the defensive side of things. Microsoft's Copilot, some other stuff we're seeing. But I also think that the offensive side of things, don't leave that aside. So definitely there. But a Scout to me is going to be our version. A lot of times I'm coming at you with stuff or with, tactics, techniques, tools. the defenders already know what I'm coming at you with. They know that I'm using Cobalt Strike, or even if I start doing a lot of aftermarket work, they kind of know what I'm coming at you with. If, however, I've got my own malware, as it were, which is way beyond sort of, EDR and MDR, then it's pretty lethal. What we've got, we want to be able to simulate those kind of attacks and bypass, defenses to show what happens if someone does. And of course, like, any kind of pen test, one of the most important things for me is to also see, hey, can you see us? That's important to understand, because if you can't see us as the known bad, then you're certainly not going to see the unknown bad. The other part is the Red Spy Academy. Those of you have been using the Red Spy Academy, it's our place where we put all the learning and knowledge. You're going to start to see some interesting things. We're going to start to add in some new content. So people that wanted to learn to be pen testers as well can learn to be pen testers in there. We also have things from Aporto where we can actually link in directly and actually run labs and tests. So that's going to be important as well. And you'll see that coming out very shortly. We've also got a couple of new technology alliances coming up, one of which, Aga Labs. This is going to be really interesting. These guys, close friends of mine, they created something that I believe, these are tier 1 operators. They're probably the best in the world at what they do. I always like to think I'm definitely not the smartest person in the room, but these guys definitely put me to shame. What they've created is something that sits at the kernel level, and it's not EDR, MDR, it's not antivirus, it sits below all that. It will stop by its nature what ransomware does and what wiperware does. So watch out for this, and you'll be able to control that and roll that out in Red Spy as well. As you start to see, we talk about modules, enhancing capabilities. And the other part is we talked about just then was being able to add training and certification pathways in the academy, so that people that want to be able to learn more about pen testing, get involved in Red Spy itself, and start to understand how they can build things and build offensive capability. This is where we're starting to see that augmentation. And this is our kind of general overmap. This is where we are on things. Some things we're almost there. Some things we're just starting. Definitely on the AI side of things. Although what was scary was I thought it would take about 6 months for them to understand it. And they came back to me and was like, it's about 3 weeks. So like the development team is certainly on board on all this. We've just started the offset, but we know the Red Spy Scout's almost complete. We're just waiting run off. So there's a lot of rolling out that we're doing right now. So 2023 is a big year for us for sure. And I think it's definitely a game changer for that. There is a cyber maturity question here. Again, you could go in and see where you are on the offensive side of things. And of course, I'm out of time. A great number plate. I'll pass you back to Jeff here.
Yeah, so we've got some questions, Darren, that we've got a few minutes to answer a few questions here. So when you think about penetration testing and automation, do you think pen testing can be fully automated, or will there always be humans involved?
I think for now, there'll always be humans involved. I never say never, but I think right now humans, like I said, that the tooling is great in repetitive. It's in its infancy still interpretive, but it's getting better. It's very good at summarizing. AI is good at summarization, the creativity. And I think, I always tell people, like, if you're an engineer, don't rely upon your skill sets. You've got to be a leader. You've got to be a challenger. You've got to be a creator. You've got to think ahead. Those are jobs that can't get replaced. Skill sets, can be replaced overnight, but, leadership and creative roles definitely can't be replaced. It's going to be interesting, but we've talked about it. What I think it does is, the tooling out there right now will augment penetration testers, and it will make them much more powerful, because they're not going to be just a DNA of themselves, but they're going to be a DNA of multiple things. And that's really the key thing is I always have my own go-to tools, my own tactics, techniques, procedures, the stuff that I know. I don't know if yesterday something came out that might be better than what I'm using right now. You try and keep on top of things, but you just don't know if, things move that fast. Whereas if you've got something that augments you and can monitor that, you can say, yeah, there's something new out. You want to try that. I think so. Right now, I think the humans have the upper hand. Going forward, who knows?
Yeah, who knows? I'm glad that you never say you never say never. So another question is, I understand what you're saying about continuous pen testing, but what if I don't feel like I really need the continuous testing? I just want a one-off. How do we handle that?
Yeah, so we still do the traditional, what I call photographs. We still go out and take the photographs and do the one-offs. What you'll find though is sometimes, cost-wise, you only have to do a couple of things a year, and you're probably in a red spy territory straight away. But we still do traditional. I mean, I still go out and do traditional testing, just because, a lot of times I think a lot of people got, still under that assumption that, pen testing is a tick box. They can't sort of connect the dots with how it can really start to understand, the impact of those risks on an organization. Because then you start to understand threat intelligence, you understand institutional context, it moves the ball forward. It's almost like, this is like pen test plus, it's a little bit more enhanced, because there's some things that maybe I go on site and I wouldn't try in a one-off, just purely because, I probably wouldn't have the time to do it. The planets have to align. Whereas in a continuous, I might be able to do that planet aligned test, but I do it at such a high level in what we call our app stores, our tool access portals, that I can make it available for every agency. So it's a force multiplier, it's not a waste. But I do believe that, hey, we do the one-offs. They tend to be sort of the lead into continuous. Most times I do a one-off, I walk with people, I show them it, show them the demos. They're like, oh, that's cool. We'll add that into it, or we'll add that next year, or we'll add that. But normally once you show it, they usually come around. Technology's coming to us.
Kind of step into it. So one of the things that we've talked a lot about in the last 2 days is cyber insurance and how much it's changing. The scrutiny is getting more intense, and the costs are going up. A question related to that and continuing pen testing. Have you started to see cyber insurance providers look for specifically pen testing, continuous pen testing type technologies, and maybe take those into account when they're pricing the premiums?
Yeah, so what's interesting is they'll turn around and, they'll ask, when was their last pen test, or can we have their last pen test? Every now and then we get organizations they want to discuss with us, because they're like, oh, it's automated. Then we have to show them like, hey, is it the analysts? Meet the people behind all this. And so they start to understand how that works. I think we definitely seeing, I know some regulations or some cyber insurance are asking for more than one-off. You'll probably see like reinsurance, especially if you're in a risky business. Maybe, those ones that spread or take the bets, they might ask for more testing. And so it makes sense at that point to move to continuous. But I also think a lot of times people, see penetration test as a tick box. We've got to do it because compliance says we've got to do it. We don't see how it values, because they understand it's a photograph, that tomorrow things may change and there's a lot of skin in the game. But as you start to move from that photograph to the movie, now there's skin in the game for my side of things. Now I've got to find, certain aspects. I've got to find those new risks before the bad guy does. There's more skin in it. And so people start to understand then, well, yeah, it makes sense. Because now I've got my own red team, augmented, as it were, with my blue team, and we can work very closely with them.
Related to that, one of the things that I've heard a lot of cybersecurity analysts talk about, and I know we here at InterVision talk about it as well, is looking up and down your supply chain, right, for risk. So have you had a scene where a customer's customer has been asking about their pen test results and maybe continuous pen testing?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of companies that we have actually that sort of like they're big companies and they monitor multiple companies beneath them. Also inside of there we have threat intelligence, so we call breach alerts. So you can put all the companies that you work with, or all the technologies that you work with, and if one of those are being talked about or breached, you'll get an alert that that particular supply chain may have been breached, or that company that provides you with, your HVAC might have been breached. The other part is obviously what you alluded to there, is where, people are saying, hey, we want to see your pen test. Yeah. We see that a lot in acquisitions. Sometimes we've got a company, it's like, hey, we're just about to acquire company X. can you run a test against them? And if they have Red Spy, we can create a separate report in Red Spy against that new company that may be acquiring. And that way they kind of identify the risk prior to the purchase.
So when you go into a company, maybe for the first time, are there some low-hanging fruits, some typical gaps that you see that you pretty much know going in, hey, we're going to find this?
I would say it doesn't always translate. You know, some companies have a hard candy shell, but are soft in the center. Some companies just have a defense in depth. You know, they're the onion, not the egg. Some companies are just the egg. You know, you get past that hard shell and inside it's all a complete mess. What we find is, you know, like, and it's really just temporary. So you might find one where you do a test and all of a sudden, you know, you get access to a user, and it's usually a combination of multiple things that have failed. You know, that user gave us that credential. It was a brand new user, didn't have MFA enabled because that week they didn't enable it. They'll go to do classes. It's usually like multiple things that fail at the same time. It's never usually one thing. But what you tend to find is that, you know, you look for the low hanging fruit. There is, you know, there's typical gotchas, you know, any kind of patch that's got a remote code execution on it is a gotcha. Web applications or SQL injections are gotchas. You know, if I could send as the internal users to the internal users, in other words, if I could spoof them, that's a gotcha because I could just win those every day.
Yeah.
And also, you know, if they're not running advanced EDR, MDR, then sometimes what we'll do is we'll just say, hey, look, just, you know, just run this executable, just see how your defenses look. Do they monitor? Do they trigger? And, you know, sometimes I'll give you an example. We had a test against one organization. They were seeing everything we were doing. As soon as we went from HTTP to HTTPS, in other words, we encrypted our traffic, we disappeared off the radar. So you know, it's kind of like you're trying to test not just, you know, the defenses in place, but the monitoring and the whole 9 yards, you know, all the control objects you have in place.
We got time for one last question. Thinking back to your AI slide and incorporating that, does that mean that because these generative AI models are learning models and they learn from the data, am I giving my data to these AI models? How does that work?
No, so ChatGPT, so Azure ChatGPT is adamant that the data stays within that tenant, so it doesn't go. So what happens is you create an index. So you can have multiple indexes. So each client, especially on the MSP model, you know, you can have multiple indexes. If it was your own like tenant, then what you would do is you would have, you know, enable ChatGPT, which is a 10-day process sometimes. You would create your own search service, cognitive search service. You would link that, you know, create an index and link that index to your data. That could be SharePoint, could be SQL Server, could be a blob. When they take 24 billion documents in a blob, you index that data and then you add that link into your application. And it's basically how ChatGPT talks to the back end of your data, but that doesn't go out. So Azure ChatGPT is very different from like OpenAI ChatGPT. That's the difference.
So it's learning on my data, but it's not giving those lessons learned to anyone else.
That's right.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, Darren, any closing thoughts before we roll on to our final segment of the day?
Just remember that, you know, it's 24/7, 365. It's potentially, you know, 7 times bigger than the drugs trade. There's a lot of money coming at you and being invested in to take you down. That's just the way it is these days. Sleep safe.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for that. Thank you. And Darren, thank you so much for spending time with our audience today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.